Let's get started. So welcome to the last of 3 webinars on allyship and reconciliation. My name's Kaila Johnston and I'll be the host for this final session. I am the education supervisor at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I've been engaged in this sort of work for the last 10 years or so, starting in 2010, working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a statement gatherer, and then amassing a variety of different positions from coordination efforts and statement gathering to community engagement, research, as well as education. Now, in the spirit of today's session, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Winnipeg, which is on Treaty 1 territory, ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations. I would also like to acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Now, if you would like to learn more about Shoal Lake 40 First Nation and Freedom Road, I recommend a couple resources. There are 2 really wonderful documentaries available. One called Urban Eclipse, Rising Tides of KK and then the Freedom Road series. The Freedom Road series you can actually access for free at the National Film Board website. It is a 5-part series which looks at what Freedom Road means to the elders, to the youth, to the men, to the women, and what that means. And there's also a really wonderful book by Adele Perry called Aqueduct, Colonialism, Resources, and the Histories We Remember. Now, one last remark I'd like to make about treaty is that this year, 2021, is the 150th anniversary of the signing of Treaty 1 as well as Treaty 2, which were signed in August of 1871. So if you are in this Manitoba region, be on the lookout for celebrations of these historic agreements, as well as be on the lookout for the other upcoming celebrations when it comes to those signing of those numbered treaties. Now, for those of you who are not aware, we are recording this webinar, which will be made available at a later date. There is no need to adjust your cameras for this recording, as only myself and my panelists will be visible, so no attendees from the Natural Resources Canada or the NCTR project staff would be recorded without knowledge or consent. Now, that being said, we'd also want to make this a virtual space that's interactive and encourages you, or I should say, I encourage you to send any questions that arise during this discussion through Zoom's chat function. We have allotted some time at the end of the session to try and answer as many questions as possible, including some questions which have appeared in one shape or another during the previous sessions. I would also like to take the moment to thank Natural Resources Canada for committing to have these important discussions and for inviting the National Centre to partner on this series. I'd like to acknowledge Elder Harry Bone for his guidance to the NCTR staff when planning the series, as well as to our knowledge keepers who have generously agreed to share their knowledge with us today. So today's focus was a planned twofold. First, touching on how we can get back to the original intent and spirit of the treaties, and then exploring a little bit about the principles behind UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and what that means for allies. I'd also like to ask Elder Bone and Grandmother Whitecloud to share some practical examples that may come up on what people can do to honor the treaties and UNDRIP through allyship. Now, you must excuse me, I'm using 2 monitors, which I haven't done before, so I'm going to try and make sure it's a nice smooth transition as I'm unpinning and repinning my videos. But given that Elder Bone has not yet arrived, I'd first like to ask whether Grandmother Catherine Whitecloud from Wapi, oh my goodness, I've already messed up there. Let me try again. Wipa Zoka Wakpak, Dakota First Nation. Whether if you'd be able to share a little bit about yourself and maybe you'd be able to kind of start us off in these kind of first 20 minutes, and we'll see if Harry is able to join us during that time.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that introduction. And you didn't do too badly on the name. It's Wipa Zoka Wakpa, which is a original name of where we lived and where our people settled, which is where I'm from in southwestern Manitoba. I'm Dakota. I speak my language and I live my Dakota way of life, as well as I'm an educator. I have been for many, many years, and I've also fulfilled leadership positions and um, am I recognize knowledge keeper, as well as I work with traditional healers. So I wear many hats, and today, at the invitation of the National Center and Elder Harry Bone, I'm here to engage in conversation with you about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and all the connections it has to everything else regarding the outcomes of various commissions that have been convened in Canada, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is where the National Center is derived from, as well as the Manitoba Indigenous, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, which is also following on the heels of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And some of the articles and the reports and the commissions that have led up to UNDRIP and the TRC and the MMIWG were originally from in our territory, or how it came about in our area was as a result of, well, residential schools, first of all, but then the following up on that similar process, which was called the 60 Scoop, where children were removed from our families and our territories and placed for adoption, and primarily in the United States at the time in the 60s, early 60s. My community lost complete families of children through that process. And then following that, we also had in Manitoba, the AGI, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which came out with recommendations on every aspect of our lives that were impacted as a result of the justice system and other systems that contributed to that, including residential school. And following that was also the implementation of this AGI, CWI, the Child Welfare Implementation Process in Manitoba, about returning children to families and to our communities and to our traditional territories. And since then, there has been much, much work that's been completed. Now, I'm going to speak from a layman's term, because I know that originally there was going to be a lawyer on this, in this discussion, and he's unavailable. So I'm going to address it from a layman's point of view, which is what we all need to learn, how it impacts us in what we do and how it impacts us in how we conduct ourselves throughout a day. I found a very interesting, I'm going to try to go back to it again. I found a very interesting document presentation that was set up by the United Nations Declaration for youth. It's an adolescent-friendly version of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I encourage those who have no experience with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to actually go through that, and because it explains it to everyone actually who are unfamiliar with UNDRIP is about and why it came about and what its intent is, to review that adolescent one that's being utilized in, I believe it's intended for junior high or even middle years, junior high and high school, about what the intent of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is, and also its application, and what young people can do in fulfilling their responsibility to understanding this and understanding what their rights are as Indigenous people. So it's a really important documentation. Now, we're aware that the UNDRIP was adopted by the United Nations in September of 2007, but there were 4 member states at the time that did not support it. They voted no, although there were 144 countries that voted for it. There were 4 countries that did not vote for the UNDRIP. And those were countries that really should have been the first ones to stand out and come up to the plate and address it. And those 4 countries were Canada, America, United States of America, New Zealand, and Australia. All of those countries, which have a very large population of Indigenous peoples. Fortunately, since then, They have since adopted the UNDRIP, and therefore we all, not only Canadians and those citizens of all of the countries around the world, need to understand what UNDRIP means and how it applies to our people. It's really important that we understand it from the perspective of the everyday person in the community when it comes to our rights as Indigenous peoples, but also our human rights. So this declaration is the only declaration in the United Nations which was drafted with the rights holders, meaning our people, Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous peoples. And we see this as a strong declaration which embodies the most important rights we and our ancestors have long fought for, which is our land, our right to our land, because it's our responsibility to care for it, and also our responsibility to care for the environment, everything that sustains us and has been provided to us to sustain a healthy way of living. And then this is where natural resources is really important, because the primary focus for our people from a traditional knowledge perspective, which is what will bring to this discussion also, is that without land, we can't live. Without clean water, we have no life. And without clean air, we're going to have a very difficult life to live. And we are seeing it now in the climate change reports that are coming out on a daily basis almost, how much our ice caps have melted, how much damage has been done to our environment, how much damage has been done to our water, the impact of the environmental damage that is affecting our relatives, the animals, those that have sustained our people for forever. The fact that some are now have been declared extinct. The United Nations addresses this through the UNDRIP, which states that we, the peoples meaningful for the more than 370 million Indigenous persons all over the world, and addressing also traditional knowledge. When you go through the document, the importance of our understanding as Indigenous peoples for what it means to be an Indigenous person and our rights as an Indigenous person. But the primary, and it's more about more than rights for us, it's about our responsibilities as Indigenous peoples to each other, to our relationships, and also to the environment and the land and our relatives that comprise everything that is living and breathing in this world. So that is the viewpoint that was taken into the whole preparation and drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights. I'm going to continue referring to it as UNDRIP because it's a real mouthful to say it each time. It's a declaration about how our people are to be protected by governments around the world, and applies to Indigenous peoples as individuals and as a group. Now, declarations an agreement among countries about a specific issue that requires urgent action. Now, the UN Declaration on UNDRIP has 46 articles. Now, it's written very legalistically, which is why I encourage you to review what is prepared for adolescents, because it's from a very layman's perspective, and it provides an understanding for adults even. If you want to get more into it, then you can go directly to the declaration, which is on the UN website and provides plenty of information. Google will provide you with lots of information in the workup, because this declaration and the drafts first went to the Organization of the American States. It went to the Indigenous peoples in Canada. You can see it on the websites on the national, provincial, territorial organizations, the workups that were done. There was a tremendous amount of time and years spent in drafting this declaration before consensus was arrived at, even by our own people and by Indigenous peoples around the world, that this was the best fit for how to articulate the rights that were given to us by our Creator, not man-given rights, the rights that we were given by our Creator, and also the responsibilities to ensure that our life on earth was kept in balance. And that for us is what really UNDRIP is about. And also, it's sad that we have to state that our people have a right to human rights also, and that those rights originally came from our Creator. However, were interpreted or I don't even want to say recognized, they were interpreted wrongly by successor governments or settler governments. So I'm just going to quickly go through, I'm flipping through my, what I have briefly prepared to share with you. For the 370 million indigenous peoples in 90 countries and plus around the world, the UNDRIP is an expression of our rights and place in the global community. It's the cultural and linguistic heritage of our peoples contributes to the world's diversity, and our knowledge and practices have an enhanced respect for the environment and the natural resources of the world's communities, the food security, health and education, traditional medicines, and protecting the health of both indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. So from that perspective, and I know Elder Bone, when he arrives, will speak to the treaty aspect, I want to provide a little bit about the linkages from the UNDRIP to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how that came, and the reason, the lead up to that, as well as the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report. UNDRIP states very clearly the relationship that governments around the world have had with indigenous peoples, which has not been a positive one. It's been one of suppression. It's been one of racism. It's been one of actually ignoring and in fact denying that we even as indigenous peoples are human, which was the case in Canada. So having to articulate these, what we believe to be our rights given to us by our Creator and our responsibilities, having to articulate them in the English language and to have it reviewed, accepted, and adopted by governments that are outside of our people and governments that were not created by that which created all of us in our environment, in our world, is a foreign concept, and is somewhat distasteful for us, but it's also necessary because that's just how the world has evolved, one of conquering and one of establishing a hierarchy. So taking this document to the highest level in the world of where people sit together and where they decide on matters that are important for the well-being of the world, which meant taking it to the United Nations. So at the United Nations, there was a group, many academics and lawyers, legal counsel, who led this process of having UNDRIP eventually adopted by the United Nations on September 13th in 2017. Now, the impact, it was referenced in the impact of the Indian residential school system in Canada, and in the United States also had them, as did Australia, and I believe New Zealand did also, in other countries, where they forcibly removed children from families and from their territories and their lands to be placed in institutions where the objective was to take the Indian out of the child. And that is a direct quote from an Indian agent, that the damage that was done was horrendous. And the relationship between from our children to their natural environment and to their families and to their place being where they were born, where we all have a connection to land in our place, that was disrupted to a large extent. It was damaged, but not broken. And the path to healing, which is a component of the recommendations coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is still an ongoing path. So the Truth and Reconciliation identifies 10 principles and 94 calls to action for how everybody can work together to repair the damage of relationship between, in this case, in Canada, and our people, our Indigenous peoples. And that is inclusive of relationships between us and you, on how we personally have a relationship, so that we can meet the objectives as outlined in UNDRIP or the TRC, and also the MMIWG, because it does impact all aspects of our lives, especially as women, but it impacts all aspects of our lives as families and as relatives, relatives within the human race, relatives amongst each other here in Canada, relatives between ourselves and the natural resources civil service, so to speak, but also now our relationship with that which you are responsible for caring for, which is the natural resources of this land. And so those documents all are linked together, and very important to have a layman's understanding of how they're linked together and why they're linked together, and the recommendations arising out of each of those reports. For example, when we're talking about natural resources, it involves not only caring for the land, the animals, the plantation, very importantly, the water. There was a commitment made by the government of Canada that every First Nation community in Canada would have clean drinking water by a certain date. Now, Minister Miller has acknowledged in the last few months that they will not be able to meet that objective. And many times you will have read on through media that there are many of our First Nation communities that still do not have clean drinking water. And for me and for others who have had the experience of years of walking this path in life on this earth, to not have clean or safe drinking water at the age of 10 for me was incomprehensible. Because at that time, we still were able to draw water from the creek. We still were drawing water from our wells. And I recall complaining to my grandmother when I, in a gentle way, because we never ever disrespected our grandmother with having to haul a heavy pail of water from the creek as a young child. She said to me at that time in our language that someday we would have to pay for water and to respect it for what we had today, which was at that time. I couldn't comprehend having to pay for water. It was right there. It comes from the earth. It comes from the land. And now I look back and say, yes, I've been paying for water since 1989 when I moved to the city closest to my community to attend university. And now it's reached a point where we have First Nation communities that haven't had access to safe drinking water for decades. And that is a result of environmental contamination that was brought on by man and industry and business. And that is something that has to be addressed by everyone that's concerned, provincial governments, federal governments, municipal governments, and big business, because the damage to the water has happened as a result of, I want to say, big business and industry. And it also is affecting wildlife, and it's affecting fisheries, and it's affecting the natural habitats. It was always pristine and always beautiful. And so environment and natural resources and how we take care of the land is so important, because I know our people that are on the land will tell us how it used to be and the significant changes they've seen in a very short span of time. In the last, you can go by decades, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60 years will show you how much damage has been done to the environment. So if you go to the UNDRIP, it tells you very clearly what needs to happen and the recommendations that are within that document for how to address the environmental concerns that are arising. It indicates the implications of state actions on the collective and human rights and quality of life that happens as a result of damage to environment. Natural resources is a vital component also of treaty implementation, and the fact that the treaties within Canada between nations have not been fully respected and haven't been fully implemented is still an outstanding issue in spite of UNDRIP and in spite of all of the Supreme Court decisions in Canada. This is a vital component of natural resource, especially in Canada, where the NRTA, the Natural Resource Transfer Act, impacts who has say over territories in the boundaries that are identified as being part of the Western provinces. So this is the UNDRIP also requires understanding by those that are parties to the NRTA, because it impacts First Nations lands, it impacts treaty lands, and this has been an ongoing discussion and an ongoing thorn for our people as it relates to treaties and what was understood to be obligations under treaty between the Crown and our First Nations people. Here's where the difference lies in our understandings. Our understandings are very clear when it comes to the spoken word, and commitments are made by spoken word, and commitments are made through ceremony. That is the most important thing for us. The treaty documents, as they are written, speaks to, and now court decision speaks to, the original spirit and intent of treaty. And that is what is being referred to, the original spirit and intent, which was the agreement between the leadership of the day and leadership of the settler government at the time that determined how the land and territory would be shared. It didn't speak anything about giving up anything. It spoke about how we would share it. And our responsibility for land and environment was never, ever given up by our people. Sadly, the damage that has been done, is being in fact spoken the most widely by our people, and the damage they've seen and how it is going to impact the life of children and our 7 generations coming forward. So treaty is a very, and I know Elder Bone will speak to that, treaty is very important. It's referenced specifically in UNDRIP, treaty implementation. It speaks to land rights and claims and what that means to our people, and that what that means is honoring the agreements that were reached under that, and the process that's been engaged with since then to complete those treaty obligations have become very contorted and have become very cumbersome when it was outlined specifically in treaty documentation what understanding was. Environmental stewardship is, sorry, I just received a notice that my internet was unstable. What role we each have to play in environmental stewardship, and what that means to us individually and to our families and to our communities and our generations coming. How it impacts fisheries, especially on the East Coast and in our Great Lakes area, where our indigenous fishermen still maintain a living for their families through fisheries. And we've seen recently the lack of understanding about the rights of our people for fisheries with what happened on the Eastern Seaboard with our relatives out there. And that need not have happened. That need not have happened if people kept themselves informed. But there isn't, what we find, or what we tend to see, is a lack of individuals keeping themselves informed, especially those that are in leadership positions, whether it be local, community, provincial, or on a national level, that these documents or these understandings, these agreements that have been put forward, like the United Nations Declaration, like the Truth and Reconciliation, like the processes identified by the Government of Canada, are to fall in line with UNDRIP. It's been adopted. It means that our people's rights, as understood by our people, are valued and are what is to be followed. And so it's incumbent upon all of us individuals to understand what that means. Then we wouldn't have the situations like what happened with the fisheries out East Coast, and our relatives were harmed because of that. It's a lack of understanding, or an unwillingness to understand or to teach ourselves. Now the resource development within the territories that we occupy, within the territories that we all share, requires that resource development have free, prior, and informed consent of our people. It's the FPIC principle. That too has reached roadblocks because there's unwillingness to share not only the responsibility, but also to share the benefits of what the land provides for us. We as Indigenous peoples understand that we only take as much as we need. We do not harm the environment and we do not harm the land. Sadly, that's not the understanding. Um, and you in natural resources are having to deal with that to a great extent. And okay, I'm going to read the chat. Is Elder Bone with us? Because I can certainly stop anytime as I go through this very quickly.
I'm just popping on. So it doesn't look like Elder Bone has been able to join us. I have done a quick preparation presentation to fill in since he isn't here. So whenever you feel comfortable wrapping up, I can jump on and take things forward.
I'm going to wrap up because it's 1:30, so I'm going to wrap up trying in 5 minutes. I'm just going to go quickly in summary over the UNDRIP and how it impacts us. Okay. So then the next one attached to the natural resource, of course, is fiscal relations, because it's directly tied to the GDP in Canada specifically, and how a lot of that comes out of their natural resources of the land, and that lack of relationship between governments and between our people, and how that impacts us, and the calls for an equal share of what is being generated by natural resources. First Nations education is directly impacted by UNDRIP, and the fact that we have a right to our languages and our education as we know it, as was articulated by our knowledge keepers and our elders and to a certain extent, our educators, that we're bound right now by curriculums that really are, don't adequately address the giftedness of our children and what our people have to offer as it relates to a way of life. Our languages, how key they are. In our languages also is very descriptive and can't be translated into English for the most part, because English, when you translate English, it's reverse of our language, it's backwards. And so it creates that understanding, that confusion happens because of that, because it's a backward way, the way the English language is articulated. So our languages, our children, and all our people have a right to that, because it describes our relationship so beautifully with each other and with the land and with everything that gives us life. I've referenced Indian residential schools, child welfare. Again, I referenced that very briefly. That was impacted. UNDRIP speaks to that also. Economic participation is key for the well-being of our communities. Justice, community safety, and security, which is also all addressed in the treaty relationship too, about what we needed to do together and the understandings that were reached so that a good life could continue to be had for our people, as was envisioned by our ancestors. So I'm going to stop at that because it's a huge document, 46 articles, the recommendations, and when you combine all of the reports to get a fulsome understanding, it requires some time. It actually requires living it, and we're all responsible for living it, because we're all here together, and that's what UNDRIP speaks to. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to you, Kaila.
Perfect. I'm going to pin my video here. So it doesn't look like Carrie Bone was able to join us just yet. I have pulled together a little presentation to talk about reconciliation, the path towards reconciliation, and the focus I often take is related to what you can do when it comes to the calls to action, but as well some things you can do which you could apply not only to calls to action, but other things as well. Because unfortunately, I do not carry the same great wisdom and knowledge that Harry does about the treaty. So we're just gonna switch gears a little bit. And with that, I'm actually going to share my screen because I like to give presentations, and I love graphics and things. Same with films and other pieces of accessible material. So just quickly, what I have there up on screen is a map of all the recognized residential schools under the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, in addition to 5 schools that are now recognized in Newfoundland and Labrador under a separate agreement. You'll notice there is some color coding there. I'll let you hazard a guess as to what those colors mean. it is the religious denomination of the institution. So you see the majority there are orange. Those are Catholic-run residential schools. Followed by yellow is Anglican, blue United, green Presbyterian. See this off moss green color in northwestern Ontario, that's Mennonite. In the north, you see there's lots of these gray colors, and that's non-denominational. But we have some unique ones as well. If you look into Yukon, you see this magenta color, that was Baptist. And if you look again out on the East Coast, those dark purples are the Moravian Mission and the International Greenfell Association. Now, what I wanted you to just kind of take from this is when it comes to MAP, when it comes to the effect and expanse of colonialism and colonial policies, it's always much greater than the dots that you will see on a map. If we were to have a map of all the unrecognized schools, day schools, sanatoriums, and the like, this would be completely covered. And it's one of the lessons I always like to talk about when talking about residential schools and the impact of these policies on communities. It's always much bigger than what you see. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about reconciliation, and specifically youth on reconciliation. In 2019, there was a study conducted with the Environics Institute on youth perspectives of reconciliation. And firstly, they asked youth what reconciliation actually meant to them, because during the TRC's mandate, they defined reconciliation as an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. And it is a very interpretive term, really, depending on who you ask at the individual, community, or national level, they may come up with different meanings as to what reconciliation means to them. For the most part, participants with some familiarity with the term were asked, and a majority said that common themes related to reconciliation were rebuilding a relationship and trust at 30 and 34%, followed by followed by an apology and making amends at 20 and 25%. So this was described as acknowledging past wrongs and forgiveness. And following that, the third most highest one was related to repairing and correcting the past. So this included terms such as correcting the past or past wrongs, making things better. This theme really stands out with Indigenous youth who've had frequent contact with non-Indigenous youth. Now, one of the other questions I wanted to highlight were what they perceived to be barriers to achieving reconciliation. So in general, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth agreed on the significant barriers. So 2/3 or 8 out of 10 Indigenous youth identified each barrier as moderate, if not major. And you'll see the list there. So the top barriers to reconciliation were myths, stereotypes about Indigenous peoples, what they received from the government, whether it was education, taxes, or health services. This was followed up by lack of political leadership or that willingness to implement change. And then the next highest one was non-Indigenous people's lack of knowledge of Indigenous history and culture. And so those were the 3 largest barriers, but you can see that there's a full list there. And I can provide a link to where you can read the full report as well. Now, the next slide I have up there is a quote from Leanne Simpson, who's an academic and artist. And she encourages people to think about reconciliation between Canada and Indigenous peoples as going beyond the scope of the TRC. So the quote there states, if reconciliation is focused only on residential schools, rather than the broader set of relationships that generated these policies, legislation, and practices aimed at assimilation and genocide, then there is a risk that reconciliation will level the playing field. So what that means, if we only associate reconciliation with residential schools, there's this perception that Indigenous peoples do not have a legitimate source of contention for all these other policies and procedures. So for reconciliation to be meaningful, it has to be a decolonizing force, and it has to be interpreted broadly. Now I see there was some highlighting things in my chat, but I can't access the chat function right now. So I'll just ask my fellow folks at the NCTR if they could text me what might be saying. Now, when it comes to reconciliation, critical to that is repairing damaged trust. And you can see what I have there reflects exactly what the youth perceptions were on reconciliation. So again, making apologies, providing reparations, but the biggest one, and the one you're likely really most interested in, is following through with clear actions that demonstrate real societal change. And with that, I actually wanted to share a little bit about a new concept that's coming out of the University of Saskatchewan by Dr. Caroline Lily Tate and Dr. William Mussel, as well as Dr. Robert Henry, which is micro-reconciliation. So imperial and settler colonialism has created a dominant culture which has become ingrained in Canadians' institutions. So this culture is perpetuated through educational institutions, government legislation, and policies which have historically put Indigenous peoples at a disadvantage by being controlled, marginalized, silenced. So you can just think about the Indian Act as being, the only race-based legislation in the entire world. So without identifying and addressing structural violence in institutions and workplaces, we're unable to sustain the education that wants to make change. So micro-reconciliation is an approach that aims to diminish racism, inequality, and inequity by challenging our governments and institutions to develop anti-racist and anti-oppressive strategies. So it's imperative that our ministries, authorities, agencies find ways to work collaboratively with Indigenous peoples in their sector to guide this work. So the goal of micro-reconciliation is to transform our work environment through encouraging personal and collective investment in reconciliation. And this is done in 3 parts: acknowledgement, witnessing, and moral courage. So we must acknowledge the colonial history of Canada's past, which would then enable us to bring into question the legitimacy of our institutions. So because our views have been shaped by this national narrative, which depicts Canadians as compassionate, caring, diverse, meanwhile, it also depicts Indigenous people's struggles with racism and oppression as being actually largely hidden. And they are either depicted as weak, sick, or violent people. So Canada has been named multiple times as one of the best places to live in the world, but comparatively, the state of our Indigenous communities is often ranked amongst struggling nations. So once we acknowledge this past, there's a possibility it could lead to a crisis of identity, as the oppression of Indigenous peoples has been rationalized and normalized for years and years. So in fact, one of the comments I've heard most often and most recently is that Canada seems to be getting worse. Now, what academics have said on this phenomena is that this feeling is attributed to an increase in accessibility around information on rights violations, violence, and suppression. So once we acknowledge the flaws in the system, we can also acknowledge that there are people who've benefited from the suffering, loss, and marginalization of people. And it's paramount to reconciliation for institutions to recognize this, because unfortunately they are continuing to fail Indigenous peoples. The next portion to micro-reconciliation is bearing witness. So we have to bear witness when individuals call out institutionalized racism, when they question the status quo, and we have to be able to deconstruct taken for granted procedures and policies. A really good example of this that I brought up with the Royal Bank of Canada earlier on another presentation is the reporting of a story involving an Indigenous elder and his granddaughter experiencing racism at a BMO bank, which then led to them being detained. And although they weren't arrested, that actually had severed the relationship between those individuals and the Royal Bank of, and BMO Bank of Montreal. So for BMO to be accountable, they have to ensure that such a situation doesn't happen again. Now, by the process of witnessing in the workplace, this is only possible if all levels of our administration are on board, because if people will not act if they fear being punished or disempowered. So we have to empower individuals in the workforce to be able to ask questions and to create opportunities for change in this shift or adjustment on what we do. So the TRC actually also used witnessing, where they called upon individuals of the public like Wab Canoe and Buffy St. Mary to be keepers of history. And by bearing witness, we can actually situate someone in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in a position which they may have never experienced. The last piece I'll talk on is related to moral courage. Moral courage, which is the naming and speaking what we know to be true. So institutions must acknowledge the truth of our reality, colonial history, causes of suffering, and continued oppression. And once we understand where things stand, this opens up discussions on how we can build a system that's not discriminatory, but we have to make sure Indigenous peoples are in the lead. An expectation of reconciliation is to facilitate a context where Indigenous voices are heard, listened to, respected, and that Indigenous peoples are in leadership roles. We need to make sure that we create safe spaces for respectful dialogue and practice that allows for reflection on worldviews, social positions, which help reduce that insecurity of facing the truth. So when we couple micro-reconciliation with education, with cultural and safety training, it's an approach that can be used to address structural racism in the workplace. Now, when it comes to the calls to action, there are 22 thematic areas. Justice accounts for the most number at 18 different calls, but you may notice that there are some areas that are not covered by the calls to action, but are then covered by UNDRIP. So you'll notice transportation and land and resources, for an example. I'm going to jump a couple slides to talk a little bit about the 6 actions of reconciliation or reconciliation. This is something I use with my educators. It's something I use with my students, as one of the questions we often get asked at the NCTR is, now that I'm aware of these things, now that I'm aware about the calls to action, UNDRIP, this roadmap, what can I actually do? What are some things that I can do in the day-to-day, and what are some things or principles I can live by? So through these 6 actions, because we're the NCTR, we do have this focus on residential schools, but as I mentioned, you can apply this to any one of the UNDRIP articles or other pieces. You can learn the history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in our country. You can understand that history and legacy of residential schools and how it links to current impacts on our communities. You can explore those unique intersections we have between treaty, constitutional, Indigenous, and human rights. You can recognize contributions Indigenous peoples have made in Canada. And the last 2 are the biggest and most important: taking action to address those historical injustices and present day wrongs, and teaching others. So I'm now going to show you what that looks like. So the first one was learning more about Indigenous perspectives, histories, and colonial impacts. So you can do that through taking a class like Indigenous Canada, which is offered by the University of Alberta. It's completely free of charge. It's a 12-module course and offers information about Indigenous perspectives. It explores key issues facing people today, as well as provides a historical and critical perspective. There's a very similar course that's offered by the University of Toronto, and it's the Aboriginal Worldviews and Education course. Now, as y'all might have already suspected by my first little bit about Shoal Lake 40 and those documentaries, I absolutely love film. I believe film is able to help us make that compassionate connection, because as much as someone can be lectured upon about this materials, unless you're able to, connect to the heart as well as the mind, we don't often see change. I do have a following slide which has some recommendations of films on various topics. But the last little bit from this slide here is reading a couple different books. A good example is The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, From the Ashes, My Stories of Being Métis, Homeless, and Finding My Way by Jesse Thistle. Most recently, Warrior Life, which is Indigenous Resistance and Resurgence by Pam Palmater. And the last one I'll touch on is The Skin We're In by Desmond Cole. Now, as for films, here is a list of films on various topics, from We Were Children, which touches on real experiences of students in residential schools, Colonization Road, which takes a look at our history of colonization and actually specifically roads named colonization and what that means. Indian Horse, which again touches on experiences of youth at residential school based upon the Richard Wagamese book, also named Indian Horse. If you're interested in learning more about the 60s Scoop, Tasha Hubbard's Birth of a Family is a very good look into that. I already mentioned the National Film Board. They have a great list of films that you can watch for free. All of Alanis Obomsawin's films are also available for free. Up there I have a picture of We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, but her 53rd film is on Jordan River Anderson. If you like music and learning about Indigenous rights and that progress, I recommend The Road Forward. A film actually that's coming out of Australia, but touches on something that's happening here in Canada as well, is the number of Indigenous youth in the child welfare system, which vastly outnumbers the number of youth taken away during the residential school system. My last two here is Nipa Mistawastawin, which is We Will Stand Up, looking at the Colton Bushy case and injustice. And finally, The Water Walker, which is a look at Autumn Pelche and her efforts to protect water. Other things you can do are to watch, listen, and read credible news resources. So keep up to date on issues like the Wet'suwet'en land rights, the Mi'kmaq treaty rights, climate activism, police brutality, racism in healthcare, the Human Rights Tribunal cases, which the Government of Canada has had over 9 non-compliance orders issued at not being able to address the inadequacies for children in care. You could research to see who's engaged in reconciliation work and reach out to those organizations, show your support. I recommend following leaders and activists and organizations, a few like Pam Palmader, Megan Sinclair, Autumn Pelche, Cheryl Maloney. You can also check up and follow Idle No More, Reconciliation Canada, and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, signing up for newsletters and supporting campaigns like Shannon's Dream, Jordan's Principle, and Walking with Our Angels. You can also participate, volunteer, or donate at marches, rallies, or fundraisers. Recognizing and honoring what Indigenous peoples and initiatives are doing for and with communities today. So sharing and amplifying Indigenous voices. Because I come in from the education unit, I always like to emphasize sharing and amplifying our Indigenous youth. What are some of the initiatives they're engaged in? Recognizing and honoring those youth role models. Again, like Autumn Pelche, Shannon Kustashian, and the Nishiyu Walkers. You can engage with initiatives in Indigenous communities by attending exhibits, screenings, or even putting on an event. You can engage with survivors and knowledge keepers, work with Indigenous groups to support efforts. You can engage in things like Have a Heart Day, Elderberry Day, or Bear Witness Day. All this information you can actually find and read about more at the Child and Family Caring Society. And you can also contact council members, members of parliament, senators, and other representatives to make them aware of why Indigenous issues and challenges are important to you and important to Canada. And the last one here is teaching others. So you can gather in groups to continue to teach and learn. You can hold a kitchen table dialogue or sharing circle. Reconciliation Canada actually offers a toolkit on how to do this. I have a picture of it on there. You can also participate and encourage management and colleagues to engage in books clubs, courses, workshops, presentations. Reconciliation Canada and a number of other organizations from the First Nations University, the Banff Center, University of Manitoba, offers courses like 4 Seasons of Reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation Through Rights, which is aimed at senior management and staff to ensure that there's education and buy-in from those who can help promote an environment which would allow for micro-reconciliation. I'm going to stop my presentation there because I believe we are at 1 o'clock, which then gives us a little bit of time for that Q&A, and I'm just going to double check to see the list. It doesn't look like Elder Bowen was able to join us. I see in the questions here, you can definitely receive a list of books and films that I talked about in that presentation there. Perfect. So with the question and answer, I saw a few come in directed to Catherine related about the UNDRIP. And I should also say, you can also get a copy of my presentation. I only use public information and materials, so that is accessible and can be provided in the other information packages that we're going to be working on. All right. I'm just working through my system, seeing if I can find Catherine because she didn't pop up on my video feed. Catherine, are you there by chance? Maybe I can find you if I type it in.
I'm here. I'm here. I was just going through the questions and I don't see any that you're referring to. I do see someone asking you about the land back movement.
There we are. There we are. So the two questions I was able to pull from the presentation here. The first one I have was, what was the delay in Canada and the other countries supporting and ratifying UNDRIP? If I understand correctly, Canada signed onto it just recently.
Yeah. The delay was that they felt that the articles that the UNDRIP had passed didn't, to put it simply, didn't mesh with the Canadian rules that they had. I think in particular it was on environment and other court decisions that happened in Canada. So on the webpage, or on Canada's webpage, on their adoption of the principles, it identifies the areas that they didn't agree with originally, and then later on figured out a way to agree with it. So if you would go to that page, because it's legalistic language, and I'm not going to attempt to explain it.
Okay, one of the other questions I had was, has UNDRIP been considered or helped in application or renewal of other multilateral treaties that Canada has signed on? The example was the Convention on Biological Diversity.
If that's a question for me, my understanding is that Canada has a responsibility to align their treaties or other conventions that you're referencing, like biological diversity, with the principles of UNDRIP, because they've now agreed to it. And this has come up in discussion since they agreed to it. I believe it was last fall, or I'm sorry, I'm just going to my notes. Last fall, from the news stories that came out. So I encourage you to do what you need to do to speak to whether it's your member of parliament, or if you want to send letters directly about the need to align themselves with the principles of the UNDRIP declaration for what you're describing here as the Convention on Biological Diversity. Thank you.
All right, another question that came in was, I work for the Office of Energy Efficiency, which I would expect would see its programming as racially neutral. But what do we need to learn about adjusting our program to support efficiency efforts in communities? Oh my goodness, I think I asked a question and I was on mute the whole time. I apologize for that. So the one that came in is, I work for the Office of Energy Efficiency, which I expect would see its programming as racially neutral. But what are things we need to learn about adjusting our program to support efficiency efforts in community?
I suggest that you meet directly with the leadership of our communities, and whether it be of the regions, there are leaders that hold different portfolios for these matters. But I know the leaders would appreciate being contacted directly as it applies to their communities or their traditional territories for how efficiency efforts can be addressed, whether it be through solar energy, or whether it be water conservation, or designated land designations. They would be the best ones to speak to, because it's specific to territorial acknowledgements and what they are currently doing. There are many communities that have now engaged in solar energy development. There are others have engaged in fisheries preservations and other such initiatives that are regionally directed and regionally designed. So I encourage you to meet with leadership.
Another one came in, asks, are there steps to implementing UNDRIP in a similar way to the calls to action?
there are recommendations attached to each. If you go further into the UNDRIP, or like for Canada, I would recommend going to the First Nations document, which identifies the recommended steps to address the documents that we had previously referenced. I'm just going to pull up that. They do have recommendations attached for how to address our recommendations. And what I'll do, Kaila, is I'll forward that to you, and then you can share it with the people online as one of the documents that I reference for recommendations that are coming from leadership, from Indigenous leadership.
That would be great. I had been forwarding some of those links or reference documents you mentioned earlier in your little speech there. Another question was, would you be able to elaborate on your understanding of consent from UNDRIP's free, prior, informed consent? The individual says, I've heard definitions ranging from agreement on how to move forward to enthusiastic support for a project.
Consent, consent according to our traditional knowledge is when we agree through ceremony and through our voice, when we express agreement. And usually it used to be that it wasn't specific, and sadly we find that now consent has to be specific, because the mutual understanding used to be there about caring for all our relatives, and I had given a description of that before. So in our traditional knowledge, it means the consent is from your verbal agreement that comes from your heart, as well as your commitment through ceremony, however that may be. That is our consent.
All right, and then I had some questions that kind of panned over our last couple of presentations or dialogues. The first was, would you be able to address why it's important to embed
technological issues? Okay, there she is. Okay, so I will stop stalling for her.
I apologize, my internet went down quite suddenly, so I'm switching to a different location to try and increase the strength of my signal now that it is returned. Okay, so I'll rephrase that question. Would you be able to address why it is important to embed Indigenous protocol and ceremony in our work environment?
It's really important because those, not only is it the recommendations that were provided during the Truth and Reconciliation process, but also during the whole conversation and the discussion and the very extensive deliberations that happened during UNDRIP, that all of that was guided by the protocols inherent within our ways of knowing and doing, and also within our language. And the reason why it needs to be embedded in, I don't see the question, but a reason why it needs to be embedded in how we conduct business with each other, because it's an acknowledgement of our original understanding of our relationships with each other, including any paper documents that we may have that solidify that. We don't consider them to validate it, we consider them to solidify it. Because that's important. It's important to understand our understandings and to give it life and to breathe it as was envisioned by our ancestors, and also instruments like UNDRIP and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Okay, I just popped into the chat function the last couple questions. I know we're tight for time, but I'm wondering, Catherine, if you see any specific question you'd like to answer before we wrap up today.
Sure, I'd love to address the about the how can we explain to others who lack the understanding that saying a prayer before a meeting is not just some cute thing we as Indigenous peoples do. How can we make space for Indigenous voices, and how realistic is it when an Indigenous person says we want our land back? I've heard that a few times. At first, to the prayer, our prayer for us is what guides us every day. Now, we don't take waking up in the morning lightly. We take it as a gift to do the best that we can throughout the day for our people and for what our purpose in life, which is to be a good relative, among other things. So for prayer is a part of our life. It's part of our original principles and the original teachings that we received as children, where our morning opened with prayer for me, with my grandmother, where every meal we prayed with it, and where we said our prayer before at night in the evening for a good day, and to, and to be grateful. It's an indication of our gratefulness that we're not here by our own design. We're here because of a gift that's been given to us by our Creator. And that's something that I think is understood by most people, that there is something much more powerful in us that put us here, and that we have a responsibility to do what we need to do to fulfill the reason why we're here. So that's the reason for prayer. It's a vital component of who we are as a people. We have I have absolute faith in our Creator and all that we are given to do each day. How can non-Indigenous people make space for Indigenous voices? By being respectful, by sharing your space. I know that our elders are very, and knowledge keepers are very, very respectful. And oftentimes we don't say the things that need to be said the way I guess others would say it, because we are being respectful. And you will hear a lot of storytelling instead, because the lessons are within our stories. And I find myself falling into that quite often too, because that is how I learned from my grandmother and my great-grandmother, is that I was never directed directly. I was told through a story or by example what was expected of me. And then, so it's simple. It's be respectful, be inclusive, and share, because that's the way you learn, and that's how we all learn and enrich each other's lives. When an Indigenous person says we want our land back, what does this mean, and how does a non-Indigenous person respond to that? What that means is that our people, we don't believe we own the land. We're caretakers of the land. And when we say we want our land back, we want that ability to be able to walk on our traditional lands and our traditional territories, to care for it, to do what we need to do to ensure a healthy life for our families. And that's very simple when we say we want our land back. That was the original intent of being on this land for each one of us, wasn't to take or wasn't to claim ownership, because it was placed here for all of us to benefit from and to live off of for a healthy life. So that's what we mean when we say we want our land back. Now, the legal aspect of it is now being dealt with through treaty land claims and through other claims processes that are being directed by lawyers. And sadly, the legal system in Canada, I'm going to make a quick note about this. My sister has a law degree, and we have many conversations about this. The way the legal system stands in Canada and other countries, it's about winning. It's not about what is right. It's about who wins the argument. And for us, that's just not possible in our culture and in our language, that we would engage in such a forum. And our elders and knowledge keepers have directed us at a national gathering that we had to address this matter with the Supreme Court justices and with other federal court justices, that we would not accept having our words through our oral testimony that we provide in the legal system in Canada, that we would not allow disrespect of our oral testimony. Most disrespectful thing ever is to question an elder's word, which is the reason why I say I never question my grandmother's or any other elder's word. Their word is the truth. And to question it is to connotate that they're being dishonesty, and that's just not acceptable. So that's where our clash is between the legal system and our understandings also. So there has to be a compromise. There has to be a compromise and a system set up that will determine how that can happen without it always having to go to the Supreme Court, which so far the Supreme Court has decided in favor of our people, but it's governments that are not accepting those rulings and not implementing them. So a long way around that answer. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, and that is the end of the questions. So this concludes not only today's event, but also our Allyship discussion series. A copy of today's recording, as well as the 2 previous recordings, will be made available, in addition to a brief summary of points raised by Grandmother Whitecloud and our other knowledge keepers that we've had on our series. So on behalf of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, I would like to thank our elders, our grandmothers and grandfathers, our knowledge keepers, for the guidance they have given us through this series. I also want to thank our National Resources Canada for hosting the discussion series, and for everyone who attended the events today, as well as in our previous sessions. So if you have any other additional questions, anything we did not cover today, please do not hesitate to reach out, and we'll hopefully be able to cover that material in those additional pieces we'll be moving forward with. So all the best. I hope you have safe and healthy remainder of the week, and hi.